Today, I'm going to tell you two stories about two very different haunted places. Even though these stories take place decades apart and involve wildly different people, the message of both is the same. Crossing paths with ghosts can kill. But before we get into those, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday, as well as this special episode of You Can't. So, if that's of interest to you, please change all the hotkey commands on the follow button's computer so that no matter which command they enter, they all simply restart the computer. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At about 2:30 a.m. on August 27, 2010, a 29-year-old man named Christopher Kaiser and his girlfriend Emily held hands and stepped out onto a railroad bridge high above the ground in a remote area of North Carolina. It was totally dark out except for the beams of their flashlights. Christopher and Emily were only 15 minutes away from the big event that they had come out here to witness, and they were nervous and excited. They checked the time, then started walking slowly across the bridge, pausing every few feet to listen for the sound of a train rumbling toward them. But all they could hear was whispering and giggling and the occasional shout coming from the 10 other people who had all hiked out here as well to wait alongside them, and who were now just standing in clusters all along the bridge. So usually, this railroad bridge, which was called the Bastian Bridge, was not a place that people went to. First of all, it was technically trespassing to be there, but beyond that, the bridge was way out in the woods and required a rocky hike to get to. And once you did get to it, there really wasn't much to see. The bridge itself was pretty basic as bridges go. It had been built in the 1850s out of brick and stone with big arches underneath, and it crossed a ravine that was about 100 feet deep. Train tracks ran the entire length of the bridge, which was about 300 feet. On either end, the tracks disappeared into the forest. And so the Bastian Bridge was just a kind of boring, typical railroad bridge with no people on it, except one night a year. And that night was tonight, because tonight the Bastian Bridge was supposed to be haunted. Exactly 119 years earlier, on August 27, 1891, a passenger train had somehow lost control while crossing this bridge, and it careened off the side, plunging into the ravine below. The accident had killed 23 people. Now, Christopher and Emily knew that regular trains had not used this bridge in a long time. But ever since the accident, legend had it that if you went to the bridge on the anniversary of that crash, at the exact moment the train went off the side, apparently a ghost train would appear, speeding along the tracks and blasting its horn. People said you could actually hear the horrible screeching sound of the brakes as they tried and failed to keep the train on the tracks, and then you could hear the screaming of the passengers as they plunged to their deaths all over again. This ghost train passing through was the big event that Christopher and Emily and everybody else had come out to see. Tonight, they were all ghost hunters. Just then, one of the people at the bridge checked the time and called out that there was only 1 minute left to go till the ghost train arrived. And with this, all the whispering and laughing and yelling stopped. Everyone on the bridge fell silent and waited. Out on the tracks, Christopher and Emily looked at each other and squeezed each other's hands. The couple was deeply in love and considered each other soulmates. And one of the best things about their relationship was the sense of adventure they both shared. And tonight was exactly the kind of adrenaline-pumping thing they both loved doing together. And so as the clock ticked down, the couple turned to watch the tracks where they emerged from the woods in the direction they knew the ghost train was supposed to come from. And as they did this, they actually began to feel the bridge tremble under their feet. And at the same time, they heard a few people start shouting with excitement. It was really happening. From the woods came a low rumbling sound that quickly turned into a roar. And for a second, Christopher and Emily couldn't believe it. Of course, they wanted to see the ghost train, that's why they were there, but they hadn't truly been convinced this ghost train was actually real. But now, as they watched, a bright light emerged from the woods and flooded the bridge. The ghost train was almost right on top of them. Suddenly, the train blasted its horn, and then Christopher and Emily heard the screeching of the brakes, just like the legend said they would. But this was not fun and spooky. This was actually terrifying. The other ghost hunters on the bridge started screaming and running, and so did Christopher and Emily. But suddenly, Christopher just stopped running and turned to Emily, and he looked her in the eyes and told her, "I love you." And then Christopher pushed Emily off the bridge. Not long afterwards, police and paramedics flooded the woods around Bastian Bridge and the ravine beneath it. A helicopter circled overhead, shining a bright light down to help them search. And it didn't take long before one of the policemen working his way down the slope that led to the ravine stopped cold and called out for help. He had found Emily. She was badly injured and barely able to move, but she was alive. The police officer looked up at the bridge over his head. He figured she must have fallen 30 feet or so. It was incredible that she had not died. As paramedics strapped Emily into a neck brace to get her safely on a stretcher, another police officer down in the bottom of the ravine shouted that he needed backup now. That officer had found Christopher. It would take some time, but the first responders would eventually piece together what had happened on the Bastian Bridge in the early hours of August 27, 2010. At around 2:45 a.m., members of the ghost hunting group waiting on the bridge had begun to cheer. They saw a bright light approaching the bridge, and they knew this meant the ghost train had arrived. But just seconds later, those cheers turned into screams. Christopher saw everybody else scattering to get away from the bridge, and suddenly he knew exactly what was happening. Passenger trains hadn't used these tracks in decades, but freight trains still did. And by some bizarre chance, one of those freight trains came barreling onto the bridge at the exact time when everybody thought the ghost train would appear. On that freight train, the conductor frantically blew the horn and tried to bring the train to a stop. But Christopher could tell the train was going too fast, and there was no way it could stop in time. And so Christopher and Emily, they started running away from the train down the bridge like the others were, but Christopher saw Emily was lagging behind. And Christopher knew he might be able to outrun this train and get off in time, but from the looks of it, Emily, the love of his life, was not going to be able to do that. And so Christopher made a terrible decision. He took a quick look down to make sure his desperate plan made sense. Then he stopped running, waiting for Emily to catch up with him. He looked her in the eyes, told her he loved her, and then he pushed her off the bridge. Christopher could see that where they were standing was only about 30 feet above the ravine, not 100. And so he figured by pushing her off the bridge, she had a better chance of surviving a 30-foot fall than of being hit by a speeding freight train. However, what Christopher must have understood was that by waiting for Emily and pushing her off to try to save her life, it would not leave him enough time to save his own life. And he was right. Almost instantly after he saved his girlfriend's life, the freight train struck him and threw him off the bridge. When the police officer found Christopher a short while later, he was already deceased. As for Emily, she was airlifted to a nearby hospital, and she eventually recovered from her injuries. And so Christopher is remembered as a hero. One night in the early 1940s in a small town in eastern Kentucky, a highly respected local man named Arthur Lewis silently made his way down a dark road. Everybody who knew Arthur, and that was most people in this small town, knew him as an upstanding, law-abiding citizen. But tonight, Arthur clutched a hammer and a chisel in his hands and crept as slowly and quietly as he could because he didn't want anybody to know what he was doing. The moon and stars cast an eerie glow across the town. Arthur was not a superstitious person. In fact, he was pretty much the opposite. But the way the moonlight hit the trees along the road made it look like something was moving in the shadows, and Arthur couldn't help but feel creeped out. Still, the moon and stars provided the perfect amount of light for Arthur to see where he was going without being seen. So he took a breath, collected himself, and moved quickly through the shadows on the road. After walking for a few minutes, he turned onto another dirt road that led to the top of a small hill that was ringed by trees. There were a few old wooden houses along this dirt road, and Arthur saw lights on inside a couple of them. So he crouched down a little bit more to try to hide himself in the dark and picked up his pace. Arthur stopped when he reached the top of the hill. A wrought iron gate and fence stood in his path, and there was a thick metal chain with a lock on it wrapped around the gate. Arthur scanned the darkness all around him and took another steadying breath. He knew everybody in town would think what he was about to do was crazy, because this land belonged to a man named Carl Pruitt, and Carl Pruitt was dangerous. But tonight, Arthur didn't care. He was on a mission. Arthur pulled on the gate, but the chain and lock kept it closed tight. So he walked a couple of feet away from the gate and just tossed his hammer and chisel over the fence, which was only a few feet tall. And so Arthur grabbed on to the thin wrought iron bars that made up this fence, and very carefully he climbed up and leapt over to the other side. When he landed, he scooped up his hammer and chisel and walked through some overgrown grass. Now, despite having the hammer and chisel, Arthur did not come to this place in order to work. Instead, he came here to vandalize the place. He had come here really to prove a point. He wanted to show the people in town that Carl Pruitt was not as powerful as they all thought, and they didn't have to live in fear of him any longer. Just then, Arthur spotted the engraved stone marker he was looking for, a marker that declared in capital letters that this patch of land was Carl's. So he gripped his chisel tightly and walked towards the marker. But just as he drew close to the marker and raised his tools to strike, Arthur suddenly froze. He couldn't tell if the moon and stars were playing tricks on him, but it looked like a shadow of a large chain had appeared on the ground in front of him. Arthur instinctively turned around, but he saw he was way too far away from the gate for the chain on it to be casting a shadow all the way over here. However, when Arthur turned back around, the shadow of the chain was now gone. Arthur was shaken up, but he kind of laughed at himself and shook it off. Things always seem to look strange in the dark. And so Arthur placed the metal blade of the chisel directly on the stone marker and then slammed the hammer into the back of the chisel. A piece of the stone flew off and fell to the ground, and right away Arthur forgot all about that weird shadow he'd just seen. And instead, he just continued chipping away as fast as he could. He knew the noise he was making could attract attention from the people who lived nearby, and he had no intention of getting caught tonight. But just then, Arthur heard a sound over all the noise he was making, and it sounded like footsteps, exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. Arthur stopped hammering and crouched down a few feet away from the stone marker, trying his best to hide. But as Arthur looked around in the darkness, he didn't see anyone. And eventually, the footstep sounds disappeared, at which point Arthur told himself it must have just been the wind blowing through the trees or something, and a bit apprehensively, he got back to work with his hammer and chisel. But suddenly, the sound of the footsteps came back, and this time they were so much louder, and they seemed much closer. Whoever it was, they were clearly making their way towards Arthur. And so Arthur had no idea if it was someone from one of the nearby houses, or if a local cop had shown up or something, but either way, he wasn't sticking around to find out. And so he turned around to make a run for it when he froze, because something was standing right in front of him, blocking his way. Arthur began to shake with fear, and then without thinking, he dropped the hammer and chisel and took off running. Minutes later, in a house located about halfway down the road from where Arthur was, a man was sitting in his front room when he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the top of the nearby hill that belonged to Carl Pruitt. The man just froze for a second. The sound frightened him, but it also confused him, because people just did not go up to the top of that hill anymore. But in the eerie silence that followed that scream, this man sort of snapped out of his confusion and shouted for his wife to stay inside, and then he ran to the kitchen and found his flashlight. The man stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and ran to the dirt road that led up to the top of the hill. And as he did, he saw a beam from another flashlight a couple yards ahead of him. He quickly recognized that it was his neighbor, so he called out to him. The neighbor turned around and walked a few steps back down the road, and the two men quickly exchanged notes about the scream they had heard. And then, together, they rushed towards the top of the hill. Once they got there, they arrived in front of the wrought iron gate, and when they shined their flashlights through it onto the ground, they saw something lying just on the other side of the gate. They both just stared at the ground for a few seconds in silence, transfixed by how gruesome the scene was. Finally, one of the two men said he'd go get help, and then he turned and ran back down the hill and headed straight into town. A little later that night, the man who had gone to get help returned to the top of the hill to the gate, now with a police officer. The neighbor who'd been there before hadn't moved. All three men lifted their flashlights and shined them on the ground just beyond the gate. And together, they all stared at the dead body of Arthur Lewis. The metal chain that had been used to keep the gate locked had been removed and was wrapped around Arthur's neck, and Arthur's face had turned a sickly bluish gray. The three men looked up from the body, and they all just nodded to each other. In most circumstances, the discovery of a dead body like this would cause shock and alarm. But these three men felt nothing but resignation and sorrow. They weren't surprised, panicked, or afraid, because they already knew exactly what had happened. Everybody in town knew the kind of violence Carl Pruitt was capable of. This is why most people in town would never have set foot on the piece of land where Arthur had gone, and why they would definitely never have vandalized something that belonged to Carl. And this was because of the horrific chain of events that began back in 1938, a few years before Arthur made his fateful trip up the hill. Back in 1938, late one afternoon, Carl Pruitt had finished a hard day's work in town as a carpenter and headed home. Like most people in this small town, Carl knew pretty much everybody and seemed to get along well with his friends and neighbors. Most days, he worked hard building and repairing things for other people, and then when he got home, he would often find his wife cooking dinner for both of them. But today, when Carl arrived home, he didn't smell anything cooking, and he didn't see his wife in the kitchen. Instead, he heard a strange noise coming from his bedroom at the back of the house. He ran there to make sure his wife was okay, but when he stepped into the room, he found his wife in bed with another man. Carl began to scream, and the other man leapt out of the bed, climbed through the window, and fled across town. As for Carl's wife, she just stayed in the bed, covering herself with a blanket and trying to apologize to her husband and trying to get him to calm down. But Carl, filled with rage, grabbed a metal chain he used on his job, leapt on top of his wife, wrapped the chain around her throat, and strangled her to death. After the murder of his wife, no one in town ever heard from Carl again. Even though there had never been an arrest or trial, the townspeople were glad Carl was gone. They tried to quickly put this horrific event behind them and basically stopped thinking about Carl Pruitt. However, within months of this murder, a series of violent deaths began taking place in town, and most people did not think these deaths were accidents. The first death that caught people's attention involved a young man who had been seen happily riding his bicycle towards the dirt road that led to the top of the hill. But later that day, someone found the boy back in town lying dead on the street, strangled with his own bike chain. Days later, after the boy had been buried, neighbors found his mother dead in her own yard. She also had been strangled, but with a clothesline, while she was out hanging up laundry. These two deaths put the whole town on edge. Even though nobody had seen him, many people suspected that Carl Pruitt must have come back because the boy and his mother had been strangled to death, just like Carl's wife had been. And not long after that, a farmer turned up, strangled with the reins from his own horse-drawn wagon, which prompted a police investigation. However, before he could finish it, that police officer was strangled to death as well, found in an open field with a large chain wrapped around his neck, looking like it had almost decapitated him. After the death of this police officer, combined with all the other strange strangulation deaths, the town had had it, they were terrified, and they went into full panic mode. Soon, stories began to surface that people had seen Carl wandering through the shadows on this small patch of land he owned on the top of the hill, just waiting for his next victim. And now, Carl appeared to have found his next victim. Arthur Lewis, the man who said he wasn't afraid of Carl, who had traveled up the hill with his hammer and chisel. On top of the hill, the officer and the two men who'd found Arthur's body stood at the gate. The officer told the men to step back and wait over there. Once they had, he opened the gate, walked through, and stepped directly over Arthur's body. He made his way through the grass and found Arthur's hammer and chisel on the ground. And right next to them was the engraved marker that Arthur had come out to deface. However, when the officer shined his light on the marker had no damage to it whatsoever. It was completely intact. Not a single piece of the stone had been chipped off by the chisel. The officer crouched down and moved his light over the stone, and he saw very clearly that on this stone were the words Carl Pruitt, and next to it were dates, the date Carl was born and the date Carl died. Because this stone marker that Arthur had come up here to deface was actually Carl's gravestone. Because Carl had died back in 1938 on the day he found his wife in bed with another man. It would turn out Carl Pruitt not only killed his own wife, but also after seeing what he had done, seeing her dead body, he grabbed a pistol, put it to his head, and fired, taking his own life. Soon after the murder-suicide, Carl's wife was laid to rest in a cemetery near her church, but her family demanded that Carl be buried somewhere else. And so Carl was buried in an isolated grave in an old cemetery at the top of that hill. And of course, since the man was dead, everybody in town assumed he was gone for good, and they would never have to deal with Carl again. But that all changed not long after Carl was buried, when people in town reported seeing strange shadows around his gravesite. And these shadows always took on the same form: a large chain like the one Carl had used to murder his wife. The story spread, and soon a morbid curiosity about Carl's grave arose in town. And that's around the same time that the other strangling deaths began, and when people started to claim that maybe Carl's ghost was responsible for them. But being strangled was not the only thing that connected all these victims. It would turn out, not long before their deaths, they had all tried to vandalize Carl Pruitt's grave. Some had done it on a dare, others did it out of anger. As for the police officer who eventually launched this investigation following all these strangling deaths, well, he didn't vandalize Carl Pruitt's grave, but he was so intrigued by the idea that Carl's ghost could be responsible that he went to the gravesite and began taking photographs. And it was not long after that that he died. As for Arthur, he did attempt to vandalize the grave, but he was not doing it out of anger or some vendetta against Carl or a dare. He was actually doing it to prove to the rest of the townspeople that there was no such thing as ghosts, and that Carl Pruitt was dead and could no longer hurt anyone. However, the instant Arthur began to deface that headstone, someone or something strangled him to death, and many people believe it was Carl Pruitt's ghost. And despite all those attempts at defacing Carl Pruitt's headstone, that headstone was always found, at least according to local legend, in perfect condition. Following the discovery of Arthur's body, people in town really began to fear Carl Pruitt's ghost and his cursed headstone, and they demanded that the cemetery on the hill be closed. And so family members with loved ones buried up there had their bodies removed and reburied in other cemeteries. However, nobody dared touch Carl's grave. So Carl's body remained in that cemetery until 1958, so 20 years after he had killed his wife and taken his own life. At that time, in 1958, a strip mining company dug up the ground on the hill, destroying Carl's body and his headstone, and so the curse was said to have finally been lifted. And so, if these two stories tell us anything, it's that if you think you can go searching for ghosts without consequences, you can't. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Wrongful, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
On a sweltering night in early August of 1980, a team of private security guards walked the perimeter of a massive aristocratic estate on the wealthy outskirts of Madrid, Spain. The sprawling property belonged to Manuel, the Marquis of Urquijo, and his wife Lourdes. It was a fortress of extreme wealth, surrounded by high walls, heavy iron gates, and state-of-the-art alarm systems. The security team had several highly trained guard dogs roaming the manicured lawns designed to alert them to even the slightest disturbance. The guards completed their routine patrol just after 2 in the morning, shining flashlights along the thick stone walls and checking every exterior door. Everything was completely locked down, and the dogs were entirely silent in the warm night air. But what the guards outside did not realize was that their heavy perimeter security no longer mattered. They were protecting the outside of the mansion from a threat that was already inside. Someone had completely bypassed the exterior alarms and the roaming dogs without making a single sound. A lone figure was now standing in the absolute pitch black of the mansion's lavishly decorated first floor. The intruder moved with terrifying confidence through the sprawling, labyrinthine corridors of the estate. They did not use a flashlight or bump into any of the priceless antique furniture lining the halls. They knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which staircases to avoid. They navigated the massive home in complete silence, making their way up the grand staircase toward the master suites. Manuel and Lourdes were an older traditional couple, and they slept in separate, heavily secured master bedrooms at the end of a long carpeted hallway. The intruder reached Manuel's heavy wooden door, turned the brass handle with agonizing slowness, and pushed it open. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight catching the edge of the bed where the Marquis was deeply asleep on his side. The intruder walked silently across the expensive rug, stopping right beside the edge of the mattress. They raised a small caliber pistol, aimed it at the back of Manuel's head, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was muffled by a crude silencer, sounding like a heavy book dropping on the floor. Manuel died instantly without ever waking up, his body barely shifting under the heavy silk blankets. The killer did not panic or rush. They calmly turned around, walked out of Manuel's room, and moved straight down the hall to the second master suite where Lourdes was sleeping. The door was locked from the inside, but the intruder simply reached up and shattered a small glass pane near the handle, reaching through to unlock it. The sound of breaking glass finally startled the sleeping woman awake. Lourdes sat up in bed, confused and disoriented in the dark, asking who was there. The intruder stepped into the doorway, raised the weapon again, and fired twice. She collapsed back onto the pillows, killed instantly. The assassin then turned around, walked back down the grand staircase, and slipped out of the mansion as quietly as they had arrived, disappearing into the warm Spanish night. The next morning, the estate's domestic staff arrived to begin their daily chores. A maid went upstairs to bring the Marquis his morning coffee, knocking gently on his door before letting herself in. When she saw the blood soaking through the pillows, she screamed, dropping the tray onto the hardwood floor. The sound echoed through the massive house, sending the rest of the staff running upstairs. Within an hour, the estate was completely swarming with local police and specialized homicide detectives. The brutality of a targeted assassination against 2 of Spain's highest-ranking aristocrats sent shockwaves through the country. But as investigators began tearing the property apart for evidence, they were immediately confronted with a mechanical mystery that seemed completely impossible to solve. There was absolutely no sign of forced entry on any of the exterior doors or ground floor windows. The massive security system had not been triggered, and the highly trained guard dogs had not barked once during the night. The security team swore that the perimeter was secure the entire time. Detectives quickly realized that the killer had not broken into the house, they had simply walked right in. This meant the assassin either had their own set of keys and the security codes, or someone inside the house had intentionally left a specific door unlocked and disabled the alarms for them. The killer also knew the exact layout of the sprawling mansion in the dark, navigating straight to the master bedrooms without hesitation. The police concluded this was not a random robbery. It was an inside job. Detectives immediately shifted their focus away from outside threats and began digging into the incredibly wealthy, highly secretive lives of the Urquijo family. They looked into business rivals, political enemies, and disgruntled former employees. But the most glaring red flags pointed directly at the Marquis' own family, exposing a deep, festering web of generational greed and absolute resentment. The investigation zeroed in on a man named Rafael, the bitter and estranged son-in-law of the murdered couple. Rafael had married their daughter a few years earlier, but the relationship had completely deteriorated. He was broke, resentful, and furious at the Marquis for cutting him out of the family's massive financial empire. Rafael made no secret of his intense hatred for his wealthy father-in-law. Police placed Rafael under intense surveillance, digging into his movements on the night of the murders. They soon discovered that he had detailed knowledge of the estate's security flaws and possessed a weapon matching the caliber used in the killings. After months of building a circumstantial case, authorities arrested Rafael, charging him with the double assassination of the Marquis and his wife. During the agonizing months leading up to the trial, detectives interrogated Rafael relentlessly, hoping he would officially name his accomplices. He would often sit in the sterile interview rooms for hours, sweating heavily and chain-smoking cigarettes, hinting at a massive web of payments and secret meetings, but he always stopped just short of giving them the actual names they desperately needed. He was terrified. Rafael told his defense attorneys that if he fully exposed the high society syndicate that arranged the hit, he would never make it to the courtroom alive. He believed the people who wanted the Marquis dead had enough money and influence to reach him anywhere, even inside a highly secure police holding facility. His paranoia severely complicated the defense team's overall strategy. The subsequent trial became a massive media spectacle, pulling back the curtain on the dark, greedy underbelly of Spain's aristocratic elite. Prosecutors argued that Rafael killed them out of spite and a desperate grab for a massive inheritance. He was found guilty and sentenced to decades in prison. But the conviction did not bring the neat, satisfying closure the public was hoping for at all. From the moment he was arrested, Rafael adamantly maintained that he did not act alone. He claimed he was merely a pawn in a much larger, darker conspiracy orchestrated by the Marquis' own children who wanted their inheritance immediately. He insisted that others had paid for the hit and provided the access, while he was left to take the total fall for a crime that benefited several wealthy people. His claims were bolstered by the fact that the actual murder weapon was never definitively found, and a second identical gun belonging to the family mysteriously vanished from the estate shortly after the killings. Investigators were never able to track down who disabled the alarms or how the guard dogs were pacified, leaving a massive, glaring hole in the official timeline of the prosecution. When the guilty verdict was finally read in court, Rafael physically collapsed into his chair, realizing that his silence had not saved him. The judges handed down a brutal sentence, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. As he was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he screamed at the gallery, promising the journalists present that he would soon tell everything. In the late summer of 1988, as Rafael continued to publicly promise that he would expose the remaining conspirators, guards found him dead inside his heavily secured prison cell. The official autopsy ruled his death a suicide by hanging. But almost immediately, journalists, historians, and his own lawyers violently disputed the findings, pointing to several bizarre irregularities. The autopsy photos of Rafael's body raised massive red flags for independent forensic experts. The ligature marks around his neck did not entirely match the physical mechanics of a standard hanging, and trace amounts of an unknown sedative were allegedly found in his system. His lawyers loudly argued that he had been completely incapacitated first and then staged to look like a desperate suicide. Many believed that Rafael was murdered in his cell to ensure his eternal silence, preventing him from pulling the rest of the aristocratic family down with him. The deaths of the Marquis and his wife remain officially solved on paper, but the true depth of the conspiracy is still hotly debated. The massive estate eventually changed hands, leaving behind a legacy of blood, extreme wealth, and secrets. To this day, the Spanish authorities refuse to reopen the case, citing a complete lack of new physical evidence. The massive fortune of the Marquis was eventually divided up exactly as the conspiracy theories suggested it would be. Those who benefited most from the brutal double assassination retreated back into their heavily guarded, lavish estates, completely insulated from any further consequences. The Urquijo estate was a place where unimaginable wealth ultimately painted a target on the backs of the people who owned it. A locked door and a high wall mean nothing when the people closest to you are the ones holding the key. But while the Spanish elite waged their quiet, bloody wars in the shadows of their mansions, a completely different kind of high society betrayal was happening on the coast. Just a few years earlier, and a few hundred miles to the northeast, the glittering, sun-drenched hills of the French Riviera offered a much more glamorous backdrop for immense wealth. But behind the beautiful beaches and the massive luxury casinos, a vicious underground war was being fought for control. And in that world, trusting the wrong person with your money would cost you absolutely everything. On a mild Thursday afternoon in late October of 1977, a 30-year-old woman named Ines navigated her white Range Rover along the winding sun-drenched coastal highways of the French Riviera. She wore dark sunglasses and drove with the windows rolled down, letting the Mediterranean breeze blow through the cabin. She had just finalized the single most important financial transaction of her entire life, and she was finally leaving the city of Nice behind. Ines was the youngest heiress to one of the most iconic luxury casinos on the southern coast of France. Her family had owned the massive, fiercely contested property for generations, operating it as a playground for European aristocrats and celebrities. But behind the velvet ropes and the flashing lights of the slot machines, the casino was the center of a vicious, quiet war between her family and a rival syndicate connected to the local organized crime families. For the past several months, Ines had been secretly carrying on a passionate relationship with a man named Marcel. He was a charming, highly intelligent lawyer who had deeply embedded himself in her private life, offering constant advice on how to handle her finances and her share of the family business. Marcel listened patiently to her complaints about how her mother ran the casino, and he slowly began suggesting that Ines deserved far more control over her own destiny. Marcel introduced a radical idea. He told Ines that the rival syndicate wanted to buy her voting shares in the casino. If she agreed to sell, she would instantly cripple her mother's control and walk away with a payout of roughly 3 million francs. It was an absolute betrayal of her own blood, but Marcel promised the money would allow them to run away together and build a new life far away from her mother's shadow. Blinded by his promises, Ines agreed to the plan. A few days before driving out of Nice, she sat in a quiet, heavily guarded boardroom and signed over all of her voting rights to the rival syndicate. The transfer of power sent immediate shockwaves through the French underworld, handing the iconic casino over to the mafia. In exchange, the syndicate wired the massive sum of 3 million francs directly into a joint bank account that Ines shared exclusively with Marcel. Now, with the money secure and the family business completely fractured, Ines was driving up into the coastal mountains to spend a few days at a private retreat. Marcel was supposed to meet her there later that evening so they could celebrate their new fortune and plan their departure. She steered the heavy white vehicle around a sharp bend, passing a few local farmers who barely glanced at the luxury SUV. She drove higher into the winding hills, and then she vanished completely. When the weekend ended and Ines failed to return to her luxury apartment in the city, her friends grew mildly concerned. They called her private telephone line repeatedly, but it just rang without an answer. Knowing that she was carrying massive amounts of cash and had just made dangerous enemies in the casino underworld, her mother contacted the local authorities. The police quickly dispatched patrol cars to retrace the specific mountain route she had reportedly taken. The search operation expanded from the coastal highways to the dense rocky valleys of the Riviera. Helicopters flew low over the cliffs, searching for any sign that the bright white Range Rover had simply skidded off the road in a tragic accident. But there was no broken guardrail, no shattered glass on the asphalt, and no sign of the vehicle anywhere in the region. It was as if the heavy SUV and the young heiress had just evaporated into the thin Mediterranean air. Detectives immediately brought Marcel into the station for questioning. He sat calmly in the interrogation room, dressed in a tailored suit, answering every question with the practiced ease of a lawyer. He admitted they were intimately involved and confirmed the transfer of the 3 million francs. But he claimed they had an argument shortly after the money arrived, and Ines drove off to clear her head. He firmly insisted he never saw her again. The police were highly suspicious of his timeline, but they faced a massive legal wall. Without a crime scene, without the vehicle, and most importantly, without a body, the French authorities could not officially prove a murder had even taken place. Marcel simply suggested that Ines, overwhelmed by the guilt of betraying her mother and flush with untraceable cash, had chosen to flee the country and start a new life under a false name. Over the next few weeks, the joint bank account saw sudden, massive withdrawals. Marcel systematically moved the 3 million francs into his own private accounts and investments. He purchased luxury real estate, bought expensive cars, and began living the lavish lifestyle of a millionaire entirely funded by the missing woman's money. When journalists asked him about the optics of taking her fortune, he simply smiled and noted his name was legally on the joint account. Ines's mother, furious and heartbroken, refused to let the police simply close the file. She hired a team of private investigators to tail Marcel around the clock. They documented his lavish dinners, photographed the jewelry he bought for his girlfriends, and monitored his real estate purchases. Every photograph was a painful reminder that the man who had fractured their family was actively dancing on her daughter's unmarked grave without facing any legal consequences whatsoever. The private detectives even managed to track down the rival syndicate that had purchased the casino shares. They staged quiet meetings with underworld figures, hoping to buy information about a potential hit. But the bosses genuinely had no idea what happened to the heiress. They had simply wired the money as agreed, legally seized control of the property, and considered the transaction complete. Surprisingly, the local mafia was completely innocent of her sudden disappearance. As the years dragged on, the lack of evidence forced the investigators to eventually abandon their pursuit. The white Range Rover was added to international databases, but it never crossed a border checkpoint, nor was it found in a shipping container. Marcel continued to weaponize the legal code against the grieving family, repeatedly filing harassment lawsuits against Ines's mother for continuing to publicly accuse him of committing a brutal murder without any concrete proof. For more than 3 decades, the disappearance remained one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in France. Marcel married, had children, and aged comfortably in the upper echelons of society. He faced numerous civil lawsuits from Ines's mother, who spent her remaining years aggressively trying to prove he killed her daughter. There were brief arrests and dropped charges over the years, but Marcel always managed to slip through the cracks of the justice system. It was not until the year 2014, 37 years after the white Range Rover drove into the mountains, that Marcel found himself cornered. The appellate courts finally authorized a full murder trial based on a mountain of circumstantial financial evidence and changing witness statements from his past. Marcel, now in his 70s and walking with a cane, sat in the defendant's chair, fully expecting his lawyers to dismantle the prosecution one last time. The trial was proceeding exactly as Marcel had hoped, with the defense hammering on the complete lack of physical evidence. They reminded the jury that the vehicle had never been recovered, proving she could have simply driven away. But in the middle of the proceedings, the courtroom doors opened and a surprise witness walked down the aisle. It was Marcel's own adult son, a man who had grown up entirely supported by the wealth his father had stolen from the missing heiress. Marcel stared at his son in absolute shock as the younger man sat in the witness box. The courtroom fell completely silent as the prosecutor approached the stand. The son looked directly at his elderly father, taking a deep breath before speaking into the microphone. He told the judge that he could no longer carry the heavy burden of his family's darkest secret, and he was finally ready to explain exactly what happened to Ines in the autumn of 1977. He testified that many years ago, when he was just a teenager, his father had sat him down in their living room to explain the source of their wealth. During that private conversation, Marcel calmly confessed to the murder. He explained that he had never intended to run away with Ines. The entire romance was a calculated plot to get her to sell the casino shares and put the money into an account he could easily access. Once the funds cleared, she was no longer of any use to him. The son revealed his father had driven up into the mountains and intercepted Ines on her way to the retreat. He convinced her to leave the heavy SUV hidden in a private garage and get into his car, promising a romantic detour. Marcel then drove her across the border into a dense, completely isolated forest in northern Italy. When they parked among the trees, Marcel asked her to step out to look at the view. As she turned her back, he pulled out a small caliber pistol. Marcel shot her in the back of the head, killing her instantly. He then buried her body deep in the Italian woods, in a location so remote that it would likely never be disturbed. After burying her, he returned to France, systematically dismantled the white Range Rover in a private scrapyard, and crushed the pieces to destroy the final piece of evidence. He told his son this story not out of guilt, but as a casual explanation of how he had secured their comfortable lifestyle. The devastating testimony from his own flesh and blood completely shattered Marcel's defense. The jury no longer needed a physical body to understand the cold mechanics of the betrayal. After deliberating for only a few hours, the court found the elderly former lawyer guilty of premeditated murder, sentencing him to 20 years in a high-security prison. He would spend the final years of his life locked in a concrete cell, entirely stripped of his stolen luxury and wealth. To this day, despite numerous localized searches based on the son's testimony, the exact location of the unmarked grave in the Italian forest remains undiscovered. The glamorous heiress who traded her family's empire for a promise of freedom was simply swallowed by the woods, leaving behind nothing but a sprawling legacy of greed. The casino she sold eventually changed hands again, the bright lights on the Riviera continuing to blink without her. We often imagine that deep forests are the perfect places to hide human greed. But sometimes isolation provides a different kind of cover. While a murderer used the woods of Italy to conceal a brutal betrayal thousands of miles away in the freezing wilderness of Canada, a solitary man was using the dense trees for something else entirely. He wasn't hiding a crime. He was preparing for a journey he believed would take him off the planet completely. Late November of 1980, a freezing storm was rolling across the western edge of British Columbia, Canada. The wind battered the trees around a quiet, rural property, shaking the windows of the main house. But out in the backyard, 33-year-old Graham Tyler was sound asleep, completely insulated from the freezing temperatures. He was not sleeping in a shed or a guest house. He was resting inside a massive life-size replica of a silver flying saucer. Graham was a mechanical prodigy. Since he was a teenager, he possessed an almost unnatural ability to understand complex machinery. Without any formal engineering education, he had successfully rebuilt abandoned steam locomotives, heavy tractors, and even vintage fighter planes, dragging rusted parts out of the woods and making them run like new. He could listen to an engine idling and immediately diagnose a microscopic fracture in a single piston just by the sound. He once spent an entire summer hauling the rusted massive frame of a 1940s logging train out of a dense ravine. Using only hand tools, a series of pulleys, and parts he fabricated himself in a small shed, he managed to get the massive boiler completely operational again. The local historical society was so impressed by the sheer mechanical perfection of his work that they placed the restored train on public display, cementing his reputation as an absolute genius. His family and neighbors admired his incredible talent, often bringing him broken equipment to fix. He was a quiet, solitary man who preferred the company of engines to people. But as the late 1970s turned into 1980, Graham began to pull away from his usual restoration projects. He stopped looking for old tractors and started spending all of his time reading obscure books about space travel, astrophysics, and extraterrestrial contact. He cleared a large space in his parents' backyard and began hauling in massive sheets of industrial aluminum and heavy rivets. Over the course of several months, he meticulously welded and hammered the metal into a perfect, heavily fortified saucer shape. He outfitted the inside with comfortable furniture, a wood-burning stove, and a heavy locking door. It became his personal sanctuary, a place where he would sit alone for days at a time, staring up at the night sky. The saucer itself was a marvel of grassroots engineering. Graham had carefully installed a complex hidden ventilation system and wired the interior with heavy-duty batteries to provide heat and light during the freezing winters. He furnished it with a small couch, a television, and stacks of blueprints. It was entirely weatherproof, designed with a thick double hull that completely muffled the sound of the heavy rains that constantly battered the western edge of the island. His parents were initially just slightly amused by the project. Graham had always been eccentric, and building strange things was just part of his personality. They figured the saucer was just a harmless clubhouse, a place for him to get out of the house and read his books in peace. They watched him carry blankets and supplies out to the metal structure, rationalizing that he simply enjoyed the quiet isolation it provided away from the main road and the neighbors. But Graham was quietly unraveling. He began telling a few close friends that he was receiving direct telepathic communications from beings not of this world. He claimed these voices were giving him advanced engineering instructions and explaining how faster-than-light travel was mechanically possible. His friends listened politely, assuming he was just heavily invested in a science fiction concept, completely unaware of how deeply he actually believed what he was saying. On the evening of November 29th, a massive winter storm hit the area. The wind was howling and freezing rain was turning the rural roads to ice. Graham walked out of his metal saucer, pulling his heavy jacket tight against the bitter cold. He walked up to the back door of his parents' house, but he did not knock or go inside to warm up. Instead, he taped a folded piece of paper directly to the glass, turned around, and walked over to his faded blue pickup truck. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove out of the driveway, the taillights disappearing quickly into the heavy sheets of freezing rain. The next morning, when his parents woke up, they noticed his truck was gone. They walked over to the back door and found the note he had taped to the glass. It was written in Graham's familiar messy handwriting, but the message was completely baffling. It was a formal goodbye written to his entire family. The note stated that he was officially departing on a 42-month interstellar voyage to explore the galaxy. He wrote that he had been invited aboard an alien ship and would return when his journey was complete. He even left instructions on how to divide his tools and property among his friends. His parents immediately called the local police, assuming his mental state had finally fractured and he had simply driven off into the dangerous winter storm while delusional. Search and rescue teams scoured the local highways and logging roads looking for the faded blue truck. The weather was brutal, heavily limiting the visibility of the search helicopters. They checked local motels, gas stations, and rest stops, but nobody had seen the mechanical prodigy. He had driven into the storm and seemingly vanished without a trace. His bizarre farewell note was immediately leaked to the local press, creating a massive, uncontrollable media frenzy. The local authorities organized massive search grids, utilizing dozens of trained tracking dogs to sweep the dense tree lines bordering his property. The dogs would frequently pick up his scent, leading to the end of the driveway, but the trail always abruptly ended where the truck had been parked. They dragged the nearby lakes and sent divers down into the freezing water, completely expecting to find the heavy blue truck submerged at the bottom of a steep embankment. For years, the disappearance of Graham Tyler became a cornerstone legend for paranormal enthusiasts across the continent. People genuinely believed that the brilliant mechanic had somehow deciphered a cosmic puzzle and was taken off the planet. The empty silver saucer sat rusting in his parents' backyard, serving as a monument to the mystery. The local authorities eventually scaled back the active search, filing him as a missing person with severe psychological issues. His family waited through the promised 42-month window, hoping against all logic that he would simply walk up the driveway one afternoon. But the date passed and the property remained quiet. Decades went by, and the legend of the mechanic who built a spaceship only grew larger. But the reality of what actually happened that night was entirely grounded in the physical world, and it was far darker than any stories about lights in the sky or interstellar travel. Long after the initial search had been abandoned, a crew of municipal forestry workers was tasked with clearing a heavily overgrown, highly isolated section of woods several miles away from the Tyler property. As they cut their way through the dense, tangled underbrush, they noticed a massive disruption in the earth. The trees in a specific circular area were completely decimated, snapped in half and scorched, creating a deep artificial crater right in the middle of the forest. The blast radius was so extensive that it had completely leveled a perimeter of old-growth pine trees, reducing the heavy trunks to nothing but splintered wood. The crater itself had filled with rainwater and overgrown brush, masking the destruction from any helicopters that might have flown over the area during the initial search years earlier. The sheer force required to create such a massive geographical scar immediately ruled out any kind of standard vehicular accident. The workers climbed down into the depression and immediately began finding jagged, twisted pieces of heavy metal embedded in the dirt. They found a steering wheel, a shattered engine block, and fragments of faded blue paint matching a specific make and model of a pickup truck. They notified the local police, who sent a forensic excavation team to the remote site. Digging through the blast radius, investigators managed to uncover bone fragments and a heavily damaged wallet. The identification cards inside the wallet belonged entirely to Graham Tyler. Investigators meticulously reconstructed the scene to figure out exactly what caused the massive crater. They discovered that during his years of restoring old machinery, Graham had legally purchased and hoarded a significant amount of dynamite, intending to use it for clearing tree stumps. But when he drove away that freezing night, he had loaded the entire cache of explosives into the back of his truck. Police concluded that Graham, heavily burdened by an untreated mental illness and a crushing sense of isolation, did not drive away to meet anyone. He navigated his truck deep into the remote woods parked among the trees and intentionally detonated the entire supply of dynamite. The blast completely obliterated the vehicle and instantly ended his life, leaving behind a massive crater that the forest quickly grew over and concealed from the rest of the world for years. The brilliant mechanic who spent his life fixing broken things was ultimately unable to repair his own fractured mind. He used the cover of a massive winter storm to ensure no one would hear the explosion, masking his tragic end with a story of a journey to the stars. The silver saucer was eventually dismantled, and the case was officially closed. It was a deeply solitary end for a man who chose to vanish entirely on his own terms, taking his own life in the absolute wilderness. A fading blue pickup truck driving into a freezing, desolate forest became the final tragic resting place for a brilliant man who simply wanted to leave this world behind. But sometimes a vehicle does not represent an escape from reality. It represents a trap hiding in plain sight. Just a few years earlier, on a sweltering summer afternoon in an American city, 5 teenage boys climbed into the back of a completely different pickup truck, and none of them ever came back home. On a sweltering Sunday afternoon in late August of 1978, 5 teenage boys were hanging out near a busy intersection on Clinton Avenue in Newark, New Jersey. The summer heat was radiating off the cracked asphalt, and the neighborhood was relatively quiet as people stayed inside trying to keep cool. The boys, ranging in age from 15 to 17, were just passing the time. Their names were Melvin, Ernie, Al, Randall, and Mike. They had grown up in the same working-class neighborhood and spent almost every single day of the summer vacation together. They were playing a casual game of basketball at a nearby public court, taking breaks to sit on the curb and share a few warm sodas they bought from a local corner store. Around late afternoon, a faded green pickup truck slowly rolled down the street and pulled over right next to the curb where the teenagers were sitting. The driver rolled down his window and leaned over the passenger seat. He was a local carpenter and contractor who occasionally hired kids from the neighborhood to do heavy lifting at his various job sites across the city. The man asked the boys if they wanted to make a few quick dollars, helping him move some heavy boxes and construction materials out of a nearby building. He told them the work would only take a couple of hours and he would drive them right back to the intersection before it got dark. None of the boys had much money, and the offer of quick cash was an easy decision for all of them. Witnesses sitting on a nearby porch watched as the 5 teenagers gathered their things and climbed into the open bed of the green pickup truck. They were laughing and joking with each other, completely relaxed as they sat down against the rusty metal siding. The contractor put the truck in gear, pulled away from the curb, and drove out of sight down Clinton Avenue. As the sun finally began to set over Newark, the streetlights flickered on and the neighborhood started to settle down for the evening. Inside 5 different homes, parents were finishing up Sunday dinners and waiting for their sons to walk through the front door. Melvin's mother kept looking out her kitchen window, expecting to see him walking up the sidewalk at any moment. When the clock struck 9 and the streets grew entirely dark, the parents started making phone calls. Melvin's mother called Ernie's house, assuming the boys had simply lost track of time while playing basketball. But Ernie's mother said her son was not home either. Over the next hour, a frantic chain of phone calls revealed that absolutely none of the 5 teenagers had returned. By midnight, a deep sense of panic had settled over the families. It was completely out of character for any of the boys to stay out this late without telling someone, and it was entirely impossible that all 5 of them would simultaneously forget to come home. Several of the parents walked down to the Clinton Avenue intersection with flashlights, but the streets were entirely empty. Early the next morning, a large group of anxious parents walked into the local police precinct to officially report their children missing. They stood in the crowded lobby explaining to the desk sergeant that 5 boys had vanished at the exact same time. They provided physical descriptions, what they were wearing, and begged the officers to start an immediate neighborhood search. But the initial response from the police was agonizingly slow and completely dismissive. The officers took down the information, but told the parents that teenagers ran away from home all the time, especially during the summer. They suggested the boys had probably just decided to take a spontaneous road trip or go stay with friends in another city without telling their families. The parents were absolutely furious. They argued with the detectives, explaining the total lack of logic in that theory. None of the boys had packed any bags, taken any money, or brought a change of clothes. Furthermore, coordinating a 5-person runaway scenario without a single person noticing was simply not realistic. But the department refused to escalate the investigation. Because the police officially categorized the teenagers as runaways, no Amber Alerts were issued, no search dogs were deployed, and no widespread media campaigns were launched. The critical first 48 hours passed, with almost no official action taken. The families were left to print their own missing person flyers and staple them to telephone poles all over the city. A few local business owners tried to help by raising a small cash reward for any concrete information, placing advertisements in the back pages of the community newspapers. They even organized weekend search parties to walk through the overgrown lots and abandoned rail yards on the edge of the city. But they were looking for boys walking around, not a hidden crime scene. The frustration slowly turned into a deep-seated anger directed at the local government. Community leaders held tense meetings in the basements of nearby churches, demanding to know why resources were not being allocated to find the teenagers. They pointed out that if 5 children from a wealthy suburb had vanished, the National Guard would have been called in immediately. It was during this desperate community search that the neighbors who had been sitting on their porch finally spoke up. They told the parents they had seen all 5 boys climb into the back of a green pickup truck driven by a local contractor on Sunday afternoon. This crucial piece of information completely destroyed the police theory that the teenagers had simply run away. Armed with this new witness statement, the parents marched back into the precinct and demanded the police find the contractor. Investigators finally began looking for the man driving out to his registered address and checking his known job sites. But when they arrived at his property, the house was completely empty and the faded green pickup truck was nowhere to be found. The contractor had entirely packed up his life and fled the state of New Jersey in the days immediately following the disappearance. The police issued a warrant for his arrest, but the trail had already grown completely cold. The delayed response had given him a massive head start, allowing him to easily slip away into the massive highway system without leaving a single trace. Months turned into years, and the missing posters on the telephone poles slowly faded in the sun and washed away in the rain. The families continued to pressure the police department, holding vigils on Clinton Avenue and begging the local newspapers to keep the story alive. But with no crime scene, no physical evidence, and no bodies, the investigation completely stalled out. The local schools eventually removed the boys from their attendance rosters, quietly packing up the few items left inside their assigned lockers. Their teachers struggled to explain the situation to the rest of the students, who were deeply unsettled by the idea that 5 of their classmates could just walk down the street in broad daylight and never be seen again. As the winter holidays approached that first year, the absence in the neighborhood became painfully obvious. Families who normally celebrated together kept their doors closed, unable to face the empty spaces at their tables. The mother of the youngest boy spent every single evening sitting on her front porch, wrapped in a heavy blanket, staring at the street corner until dawn. The disappearance of the 5 teenagers became one of the most heartbreaking, unresolved mysteries in the history of the city. 5 empty chairs sat at 5 different dinner tables, and 5 mothers grew older without ever knowing what happened to their sons on that sweltering August afternoon. The entire community felt a heavy, lingering shadow hanging over the neighborhood. Decades passed in absolute silence. The original detectives on the case retired, and the dusty files were moved into a storage basement. The families slowly accepted that the boys were never coming home, but they still desperately wanted to know where they were buried. It seemed like the truth had permanently vanished, along with the green pickup truck and the fleeing contractor. But decades later, a sudden breakthrough occurred in a completely unrelated criminal trial taking place far outside of the city limits. A cooperating witness took the stand to offer information in exchange for leniency. The prosecutors asked him what he knew about cold cases, and the witness claimed he had specific knowledge regarding the 5 boys who vanished from Newark. The courtroom fell completely silent as the witness detailed a horrific sequence of events. He testified that the contractor had driven the teenagers to a massive abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He promised to pay them as soon as they moved a series of heavy crates into a specific room in the basement. The boys eagerly carried the materials downstairs. Once all 5 teenagers were inside the windowless basement room, the contractor slammed the heavy metal door shut and locked it from the outside. The witness stated that the man then systematically poured gasoline all over the upper floors of the wooden structure, struck a match, and walked away. The boys were completely trapped underground as the building burned to the ground. Detectives scrambled to corroborate the witness testimony by pulling municipal fire records from 1978. They found a dispatch log matching the exact date and location described by the informant. A massive 3-alarm fire had indeed destroyed a large commercial warehouse that Sunday evening, severely damaging the structural integrity of the deep concrete basement. The intense heat of the fire caused the entire structure to collapse in on itself, filling the basement with tons of burning debris and concrete. The fire department eventually extinguished the blaze, but because it was an abandoned building, nobody ever searched the deep rubble for human remains. The site was eventually bulldozed over and paved into an empty commercial parking lot. Despite the incredibly detailed testimony, the authorities faced a massive logistical nightmare. The physical location of the warehouse had been drastically altered over the decades, making it entirely impossible to excavate the site without demolishing the surrounding city blocks. Because no physical remains could be recovered, the contractor was never officially charged with murder. To this day, the families have never received physical closure. The men, who would have been in their 60s now, are still officially listed as missing persons. A simple offer of weekend work turned into a complete erasure of 5 young lives obscured by systemic failures and a fire that burned away all the evidence before anyone even knew to look for it. A forgotten fire in an empty American warehouse allowed a man to hide his victims under tons of burning debris, relying entirely on the chaos of the flames to mask a calculated execution. But sometimes people do not use chaos to hide their crimes. Some people rely on absolute silence and professional precision, walking straight into the most heavily guarded homes in the world. In the fading twilight of late November 1977, a 45-year-old economist named Richard Smits steered his dark sedan through the quiet, heavily guarded suburban streets of Pretoria, South Africa. It was a Tuesday evening, and the neighborhood was settling into its usual wealthy silence. The large manicured properties were surrounded by high stone walls and heavy iron gates designed to keep the chaotic political tensions of the capital city far away. Richard was a highly ambitious man who had spent his entire career navigating the complex world of international finance. He was currently running a very tense political campaign as a prominent candidate for the ruling party, with deep, well-known aspirations of becoming the next Minister of Finance. His job required him to travel frequently to Europe and the Americas, dealing with foreign banks and highly sensitive economic data that few people in the country had access to. His 42-year-old wife, Jeanne, spent most of her time managing their large estate. The house was essentially a residential fortress outfitted with heavy deadbolts, security alarms, and trained guard dogs that roamed the perimeter. The couple lived a very quiet, disciplined life, completely aware that Richard's high-level government clearance made them a potential target for political extremists. They rarely had unannounced visitors and always kept the heavy gates locked. The political climate in South Africa at that time was incredibly volatile and steeped in heavy paranoia. The government was facing massive international sanctions, and secret meetings were constantly being held behind closed doors to keep the economy afloat. Richard had recently returned from a highly confidential trip to Europe, and those closest to him noted that his demeanor had drastically changed. He seemed unusually anxious, constantly checking his briefcase and mirrors. On the day of his death, Richard spent the afternoon in a series of closed-door meetings with high-ranking campaign officials. He left his office just as the sun began to set, placing his heavy leather briefcase on the passenger seat of his car. He did not tell his secretary exactly where he was going, only mentioning that he needed to stop by his house to pick up a few documents before attending a large political rally scheduled for later that same evening across town. As Richard pulled his sedan into his private driveway, he pressed the button to open the heavy automated garage door. The machinery hummed quietly, lifting the wooden panels to reveal the dark interior. He parked his car inside, turned off the headlights, and reached for his briefcase. But as he looked through the windshield toward the interior door that led into the kitchen, he noticed it was standing slightly cracked open, spilling a thin line of yellow light into the garage. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, listening to the absolute silence of the evening. He assumed Jean had simply stepped out to the garden to grab something, or perhaps the domestic staff had forgotten to pull the heavy door completely shut before leaving for the day. Since the exterior perimeter alarms had not been triggered and the dogs were not barking, the idea of a violent break-in seemed completely illogical. He grabbed his heavy briefcase and opened his car door. But as Richard stepped out of the vehicle and moved toward the cracked interior door, the shadows inside the garage suddenly shifted. Before he could even call out his wife's name, 2 highly trained men stepped out from the blind spots behind his vehicle. They moved with absolute cold precision, completely devoid of the chaotic energy usually seen in a home invasion. They cornered the politician against the hood of his own car before he could even reach the handle. One of the men raised a suppressed weapon and fired, executing Richard immediately in the quiet confines of his own garage. The men did not scramble or flee after the shot was taken. They calmly stepped over the body, ensuring the target was entirely deceased, and quietly slipped out through a side gate into the warm South African night. The entire assassination was completely silent, leaving the affluent neighborhood completely undisturbed as the streetlights flickered on. What Richard never knew in his final moments was that the assassins had already been inside the house for quite some time. They had expertly bypassed the exterior security measures, pacified the guard dogs without making a sound, and cornered Jean in the living room long before her husband ever pulled into the driveway. She had been shot multiple times and brutally stabbed, leaving her body on the expensive carpet while the killers patiently waited in the dark for Richard. A few hours later, a hired driver pulled up to the security gate to pick Richard up for his scheduled political rally. The driver honked the horn lightly, expecting the candidate to walk out of the front door with his briefcase. When nobody emerged, the driver stepped out of his vehicle and walked up to the grand entryway. He rang the heavy brass doorbell repeatedly, but the massive house remained dead quiet. Feeling that something was wrong, he tried the front door handle. The door was unlocked, which was entirely out of character for the security-conscious family. The driver cautiously pushed it open and walked into the grand foyer, calling out for Richard and Jeannie. He walked slowly down the main hallway, noticing that a few drawers had been pulled open and papers were scattered across the floor. As he turned the corner into the formal living room, he stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the brutal scene resting on the pristine carpet. The driver immediately backed out of the house, sprinting to his car to radio the local authorities. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street was swarming with patrol cars, heavily armed tactical officers, and bright spotlights. When the lead homicide detectives walked into the living room, they quickly confirmed that Jean was deceased. They spread out through the massive estate clearing room by room until they finally found Richard lying next to his sedan in the garage. Detectives immediately realized this was not a standard robbery. The house was filled with expensive jewelry, fine art, and thousands of dollars in cash, but absolutely none of it had been taken. The only things that appeared to be disturbed were Richard's private filing cabinets and his briefcase, which had been thoroughly searched and emptied onto the floor. The brutality of the double murder looked exactly like a highly coordinated professional military assassination. The sheer violence of the attack was incredibly shocking to the investigators, but when they walked into the kitchen, they found something that completely changed the entire trajectory of the case. Sprayed across the pristine white cupboards and the expensive wallpaper in bright red paint were 6 massive dripping letters spelling out the word Rowdom. It was a cryptic, entirely nonsensical string of letters that did not translate to any known word in any local dialect. Investigators stood in the kitchen, completely baffled by the bright red letters. The entire assassination had been carried out with the cold, sterile efficiency of a highly trained covert military squad, yet leaving a massive dripping message spray-painted on the walls felt incredibly chaotic and highly theatrical. Detectives brought in linguists, cryptologists, and intelligence analysts to decipher the word, but absolutely nobody could figure out what it actually meant. The local press immediately caught wind of the bizarre spray-painted clue, and the news of the assassination sent a wave of absolute paranoia through the upper echelons of the South African government. Whispers began circulating through the capital that this was not a random act of political violence, but a heavily sanctioned state execution. Detectives working the case were quietly warned by their direct superiors to be incredibly careful with the files and to ask fewer questions. Independent journalists and private investigators began digging aggressively into Richard's recent movements in Europe leading up to his death. They discovered that the ambitious economist had allegedly uncovered a massive, sprawling offshore corruption scandal. According to the quiet rumors, several of the highest-ranking government officials in the country were secretly siphoning millions of dollars of state money and hiding it in international banks to avoid heavy sanctions. People who worked closely with Richard claimed he was actively planning to use this explosive financial information to leverage his way into the Minister of Finance position or to blow the whistle entirely just days before the upcoming national election. If true, he possessed enough raw data to completely collapse the ruling party and send several powerful men to prison. This theory perfectly explained why his private files and his briefcase had been so thoroughly searched. The cryptic word Rowdom continued to haunt the investigation for decades. Some intelligence analysts theorized it was a specific anagram for an offshore shell company used to launder the stolen money. Others believed it was an intimidation tactic, a highly specific code meant entirely for the eyes of other corrupt officials to let them know the state was watching them. A few journalists even suggested it was just a hurried, misspelled Afrikaans phrase meant to confuse police. Despite thousands of man-hours and endless debates among historians, no definitive translation for the red letters was ever agreed upon. The complete lack of physical evidence left at the scene meant investigators had absolutely nothing to test as forensic technology eventually advanced. The hit squad was so professional that they did not leave a single fingerprint, hair, or footprint behind in the sprawling estate melting back into the shadows of the government apparatus. As the years dragged on, the families of Richard and Jean fought desperately for answers, but they met a massive wall of official silence. Key pieces of evidence from the crime scene mysteriously vanished from secure police lockups, and the original case files were allegedly heavily redacted before being buried in the National Archives. Every time a new detective tried to reopen the investigation, they were quickly reassigned or told that the case was permanently closed. Despite intense public pressure and the massive political implications of the crime, absolutely nobody was ever arrested or officially charged with the execution of the Smiths family. The people who ordered the hit maintained their powerful positions in the government, entirely insulated from any legal consequences. The double murder slowly faded into the dark, highly secretive history of a divided nation, officially remaining an unsolved homicide to this very day. A locked suburban fortress and a heavily guarded perimeter meant absolutely nothing when the threat was coming from the very people tasked with protecting the country. While the cold, calculated execution of a rising politician in South Africa was heavily cloaked in state secrets and cryptic messages, other brutal crimes are committed right out in the open. Sometimes the mystery is not about who pulled the trigger in the dark, but how a killer can confess and still walk free. A year earlier, and an ocean away from the sprawling estates of Pretoria, a vibrant summer afternoon on the glamorous coast of Brazil was about to end in absolute tragedy. The beach house was bathed in sunlight, and the doors were wide open to the ocean breeze. But the danger waiting inside was not a highly trained state assassin acting on secret orders. It was someone who claimed to act entirely out of love, weaponizing the justice system to justify a violent execution. On a sweltering Thursday afternoon in the late summer of 1977, a 31-year-old socialite named Angelina Dias was pacing across the hardwood floor of a luxury beach house in Brazil. She was renting a massive, sun-drenched villa in the coastal resort town of Búzios, a place known for its pristine beaches and wealthy tourists. The massive glass doors facing the ocean were pushed wide open to let in the breeze, which meant the sound of a very heated argument was carrying directly out onto the sand. A few neighbors walking by the property paused for a moment when they heard a man shouting, but they quickly kept walking. Angelina was famous in the local tabloids for her dramatic lifestyle. Angelina had grown up entirely surrounded by wealth and privilege in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the country. She was constantly photographed at charity galas and private yacht parties, completely accustomed to getting whatever she wanted. She lived her life with a fierce independence that frequently put her at odds with traditional expectations. When she first met Diego at a private dinner party, he was completely captivated by her energy. He was a wealthy businessman who managed several large family accounts, but his personal life was heavily structured and deeply unfulfilling. He aggressively pursued Angelina, showering her with expensive gifts and constant attention until she finally agreed to date him. The early months of their relationship were spent traveling between luxury resorts and spending massive amounts of money. But the honeymoon phase faded incredibly quickly. Diego became deeply obsessed with her whereabouts, constantly questioning who she was talking to and demanding that she sever ties with several of her oldest friends who did not approve of him. His intense paranoia eventually led to loud, highly embarrassing public arguments in restaurants and hotel lobbies. Angelina realized that he did not view her as a partner, but rather as an expensive possession that he needed to completely control. The isolation and the constant accusations drained her completely, pushing her to finalize her decision to leave him. People in the neighborhood assumed the yelling that afternoon was just another standard disagreement between the glamorous socialite and her 40-year-old lover. Diego had recently left his wife and children to be with Angelina, and their high-profile relationship was constantly fueled by intense jealousy, expensive parties, and very public arguments on the beach. But the argument taking place inside the villa that afternoon was not a routine lovers' quarrel over dinner plans or jealous rumors. Angelina had spent the last few weeks realizing that Diego was deeply controlling and volatile. She had finally reached her breaking point and made a firm decision. She told Diego that the relationship was officially over. She stood in the center of the living room and demanded that he pack his belongings and leave her beach house immediately. Diego was entirely stunned by the rejection. He had completely upended his own life and abandoned his family just to be with her, and his pride simply could not handle being abruptly dismissed in the middle of a vacation. He tried to argue his way back into her good graces, shifting rapidly between begging for another chance and shouting insults at her. Angelina refused to back down. She crossed her arms, shook her head, and pointed directly toward the front door. She told him there was absolutely nothing left to discuss and repeatedly ordered him to get off her property. Seeing that she was completely serious, Diego finally stopped arguing. His face flushed bright red, and he turned around without saying another word. He walked heavily toward the front entrance, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the driveway. Angelina let out a long sigh of relief, assuming the worst part of the terrible breakup was finally over. She walked over to the kitchen counter to pour herself a glass of water, listening as Diego's footsteps crunched heavily against the gravel outside. She expected to hear the engine of his luxury car start up, followed by the sound of his tires pulling out onto the main road. But the driveway remained completely quiet. The engine never turned over. Instead, Angelina heard the heavy metallic sound of a car door opening and closing, followed by the immediate crunch of footsteps walking back toward the front entrance of the villa. The front door swung open again, and Diego stepped back into the living room. Angelina turned around from the kitchen counter, clearly annoyed that he had returned. She started to ask him why he was still in the house, but the words caught in her throat. Diego was not carrying his travel bags or asking for his keys. He was holding a small caliber pistol that he kept stored in the glove compartment of his car. He did not say a single word as he raised the weapon, pointing the barrel directly at her face from across the room. Diego pulled the trigger 4 times in rapid succession. The loud pops echoed off the high ceilings of the villa and spilled out onto the nearby beach. Angelina was struck multiple times in the head and collapsed instantly onto the tile floor. She was completely motionless. Diego lowered the weapon, stared at her for a few seconds, and walked back out the door. The crime scene inside the villa was completely chaotic. The high ceilings amplified the sound of the gunshots, which meant several people called the local police at the exact same time. The first officers to arrive found the glass doors wide open and the ocean breeze blowing through the quiet living room, heavily contrasting with the brutal reality on the floor. They quickly taped off the surrounding property to keep the growing crowd of wealthy tourists and curious neighbors away from the house. Detectives walked through the pristine rooms, noting that nothing had been stolen or even slightly disturbed. It was immediately clear that this was not a random robbery gone wrong, but a highly targeted and emotional execution. Neighbors who heard the gunshots immediately rushed toward the property. They told the police they saw the wealthy businessman calmly walking out of the house moments after the loud noises. The local police secured the scene and launched an immediate manhunt for the wealthy playboy. It did not take them long to track him down and take him into custody. The physical evidence was entirely overwhelming, and the motive was painfully obvious. Diego did not even bother to deny pulling the trigger. He formally admitted to shooting his girlfriend after she ended their relationship. The local prosecutors assumed it would be an incredibly straightforward murder trial that would result in a lengthy prison sentence. But Diego came from a world of immense wealth and deep political connections. His family hired a team of the most expensive, high-powered defense attorneys in the entire country to represent him. When the trial officially began in 1979, the courtroom was packed with journalists and television cameras eager to cover the high society scandal. The defense team knew they could not argue the physical facts of the shooting, so they completely changed their strategy. Instead of defending Diego, they put the victim on trial. They systematically painted Angelina as a manipulative, promiscuous woman who had intentionally driven a good, honorable family man to the absolute brink of insanity through her actions. They brought up her past relationships, her parties, and her lifestyle, portraying her as a dangerous threat to traditional family values. The lead defense attorney stood in front of the jury and passionately argued an antiquated, highly controversial legal concept. He claimed that Diego had shot her in legitimate defense of his own personal honor. The argument essentially stated that because Angelina had humiliated him by breaking off the affair after he abandoned his family, she had provoked the attack. According to this highly flawed legal logic, Diego was not a cold-blooded murderer. He was simply a man acting out of deep, uncontrollable passion, entirely overwhelmed by the emotional damage she caused. The prosecution strongly objected, pointing out that firing 4 bullets into someone's face over a breakup is not self-defense under any definition. They reminded the court that Angelina was unarmed and simply trying to end a toxic relationship. But the defense attorneys were incredibly charismatic, aggressively playing on the social biases of the era. The media circus surrounding the trial was completely unprecedented. Television crews camped outside the courthouse every single day, broadcasting the developments to millions of viewers. The public was deeply divided, with some people firmly believing the defense narrative that the socialite had destroyed his life, while others saw through the blatant victim blaming. Inside the courtroom, the defense attorneys brought in a series of highly paid psychological experts. These experts used complex medical jargon to argue that Diego suffered from a sudden, uncontrollable break from reality. They claimed his actions were not premeditated, but rather an automatic physical response to the overwhelming emotional trauma of the breakup. As the trial stretched on for weeks, the media coverage became highly sensationalized. Newspapers published degrading articles about the victim, focusing entirely on her romantic history rather than the brutal violence that ended her life. The narrative slowly shifted in the public consciousness, creating a deeply toxic environment around the proceedings. Inside the courtroom, Diego sat quietly at the defense table, occasionally wiping away tears, while his lawyers painted him as the true victim of the tragedy. They argued that a wealthy, respected man like him would never throw his life away unless he was pushed into a state of temporary madness by a deeply manipulative and emotionally abusive partner. When it came time for the verdict, the tension in the room was entirely palpable. The judge read the decision aloud to a completely silent gallery. The jury had accepted the defense strategy. They found Diego guilty of manslaughter rather than intentional murder, explicitly citing his emotional distress and citing the defense of his personal honor. Because of this drastically reduced charge, Diego was sentenced to merely 2 years in prison. Furthermore, because he had already served a small amount of time while waiting for the trial to begin, his sentence was instantly suspended. The judge formally hit the gavel, declared the proceedings finished, and informed the wealthy playboy that he was free to go. Diego stood up from the defense table, smiled at his attorneys, and walked right out the front doors of the courthouse as a completely free man. The sheer audacity of the verdict sent an immediate, massive shockwave across the entire country. A man had executed his girlfriend in broad daylight, confessed to the crime, and completely walked away from it. People who followed the case on the evening news were absolutely disgusted. Legal scholars wrote angry editorials in the national papers, pointing out that a man could receive a harsher penalty for stealing a luxury vehicle than for firing a weapon into a crowded residential home. The ruling sent a deeply dangerous message to anyone watching the proceedings. The victim's family was completely devastated, realizing that the man who broke into their lives and destroyed their daughter was going to simply return to his wealthy estate without facing any true consequences. But they were not alone in their anger. The blatant miscarriage of justice was acting as a massive spark in a country that was ready for a change. The systemic failure of the justice system was so incredibly blatant that it triggered an immediate, explosive cultural uprising. Thousands of women across Brazil took to the streets in massive, highly organized protests. They marched through the major cities, carrying heavy banners and chanting loudly outside the government buildings and local courthouses. The protests unified under a single powerful slogan that was painted on walls and printed on millions of flyers across the nation. The phrase was simple but carried massive weight. It translated to, "He who loves does not kill." The movement demanded an immediate end to the antiquated laws that allowed violent men to justify their crimes using emotional excuses. The public outrage was so sustained and so overwhelmingly loud that the appellate courts had absolutely no choice but to intervene. They reviewed the transcripts of the trial and officially declared that the legitimate defense of honor argument had completely derailed the legal process. The courts threw out the suspended sentence and ordered a second trial. In 1981, Diego found himself sitting at the defense table once again. But this time, the cultural landscape of the country had fundamentally shifted. The courtroom was heavily monitored by independent civil rights groups, and the defense attorneys were absolutely forbidden from using the victim's personal history to justify a violent execution. Without the ability to blame the socialite for her own murder, the defense completely collapsed under the weight of the physical evidence. The second jury did not hesitate for long. They found Diego fully guilty of premeditated murder, completely ignoring any claims of temporary emotional distress. He was immediately sentenced to 15 years in prison. The wealthy playboy was finally handcuffed and led away to serve his time behind bars. The tragic death of the glamorous socialite ultimately became a massive turning point in the nation's legal history. It officially established a fierce precedent that violence against a partner could never be legally justified by bruised egos or outdated claims of lost honor. While a deeply guilty man almost managed to weaponize a courtroom to secure his own absolute freedom, the justice system can also fail in the exact opposite direction. A few years earlier, in a quiet coastal city across the ocean, a completely innocent man was forced to sit in a sterile interrogation room while the police actively built a cage around him. In the late autumn of 1977, a 35-year-old man named Frank Sorensen sat in a stark, dimly lit interrogation room in the city of Trondheim, Norway. He was a quiet, solitary person who lived in a small, sparse apartment and worked various odd jobs to get by. Frank was completely deaf and had a severe speech impediment that made it nearly impossible for anyone who did not know him well to understand anything he tried to communicate. Across the heavy wooden table, two veteran detectives were leaning forward, their faces just inches from his. They were shouting at the top of their lungs, their mouths moving in rapid aggressive patterns that Frank could not follow. He watched the way their neck tendons tightened and the frustration grew in their eyes, but he had no idea what they were asking him. There was no sign language interpreter in the room, and Frank felt a rising sense of absolute panic. The local police were under immense pressure from the public because the city was currently gripped by a wave of fear. Just a year earlier, in September of 1976, a 21-year-old university student named Sarah had been found murdered in a local park. The investigation had turned up absolutely no leads, and the case had gone cold. Then, in October of 1977, a second student named Tina vanished while walking home. When Tina's body was discovered a few days later, the community demand for an arrest became deafening. Detectives began scouring the city for anyone who lived on the margins of society, looking for a convenient target they could pressure. They eventually focused on Frank simply because he was often seen walking alone late at night and lacked the social standing to defend himself. They brought him in for questioning without any legal representation or a translator. The interrogation lasted for several hours without a break. The detectives used aggressive body language, slamming their fists on the table and pointing at photographs of the crime scenes. Frank tried to explain through basic hand gestures that he had been at home, but the officers interpreted his confusion and his frantic attempts to communicate as signs of guilt. They began writing out a statement in complex legal language that Frank was entirely unable to read. One of the detectives put a pen in Frank's hand and pointed aggressively at a line at the bottom of the page. Frank looked at the man's face, seeing a flicker of what he thought was kindness, and assumed that if he signed the paper, they would finally let him go home. He scribbled his name on the document, not realizing he had just signed a full confession for two brutal murders that he had absolutely nothing to do with during those 2 years. When the case finally went to trial, the prosecution relied almost entirely on that signed statement. Frank sat in the courtroom watching the lawyers talk for hours while he remained in a world of total silence. He could not understand the testimony against him, and his own court-appointed attorney did not seem to believe his claims of innocence. The jury saw a man who had confessed to the crimes and who seemed unable or unwilling to explain his actions. The judges did not take long to reach a decision. Frank was found guilty of both murders and was sentenced to 20 years in a high-security prison. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, beginning a long, agonizing journey into a system that had completely failed to protect his basic rights. For the next 18 years, Frank existed in a state of isolation, surrounded by guards and inmates who made no effort to learn how to communicate with him. Inside the prison, Frank spent his time in the library trying to teach himself enough written language to draft letters to various legal aid organizations. He wrote hundreds of notes, most of which were ignored or discarded by the staff. He maintained a quiet, disciplined routine, never causing trouble and never stopping his attempt to find someone who would listen to his side of the story. He grew older in silence, his hair turning gray as the decades passed. In the mid-90s, Frank was finally released on parole. He was a broken man, lacking any money, a job, or a support system. He moved into a tiny, government-subsidized apartment and lived a very reclusive life, still carrying the heavy label of a convicted double murderer. The people in his neighborhood avoided him, and he spent most of his days sitting on a park bench watching the world go by without ever being a part of it, still hoping for a miracle. The miracle finally began to take shape in 2004, more than 25 years after Frank had first been forced into that interrogation room. A local journalist became interested in the old Trondheim cases and began digging through the original police files. He immediately noticed the total lack of physical evidence linking Frank to the scenes and the fact that no sign language interpreter had ever been present during the initial questioning of the suspect. At the same time, an elderly man in a nearby hospital was nearing the end of his life. He was a career criminal with a long history of violent offenses who had spent much of his life in and out of the justice system. As his health rapidly declined, he sent for a local priest and a lawyer. He told them that he had a heavy weight on his soul that he needed to remove before he died, and he began to describe 2 murders from the late 1970s. The dying man provided specific details about the crimes that had never been released to the public. He described the exact items Sarah had been carrying in her bag and the specific way he had hidden Tina's body in the woods. He admitted that he had watched the news of Frank's arrest with a sense of relief, knowing that an innocent man was taking the blame for his actions. He signed a formal confession as the detectives stood by his hospital bed. This new evidence triggered an immediate massive review of Frank's conviction. The Norwegian Ministry of Justice launched an official inquiry which quickly uncovered a systemic pattern of police corruption and extreme ableism. They realized that the detectives had intentionally targeted a vulnerable man to close 2 high-profile cases and had suppressed any evidence that pointed away from him. The findings were a massive embarrassment to the entire justice system. In 2005, a high court judge formally overturned both of Frank's convictions. He was completely exonerated, and the government issued a public apology for the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of the country. Frank sat in the courtroom once again, this time with a team of professional interpreters who signed the judge's words to him in real time. For the first time in his life, Frank understood that the world finally knew he was innocent. The government awarded Frank a substantial financial settlement to compensate him for the 18 years he had spent in prison and the decades he had spent as a social pariah. He used some of the money to buy a small, comfortable house and began working with advocates for the deaf and hard of hearing to ensure that what happened to him could never happen to anyone else. He was finally a free man, but the years of isolation had taken a permanent toll on his health. Just a few months after his exoneration, Frank Sorensen passed away quietly in his sleep. He died in a house he owned, with his name finally cleared of the crimes that had defined most of his adult life. The detectives who had coerced his confession were long retired, and while the legal system had eventually corrected its mistake, it had done so far too late to give Frank back the life it had stolen from him in that stark interrogation. Room. The case remains a foundational lesson in the Norwegian legal system, cited in every law school as a reminder of the dangers of tunnel vision and the importance of protecting marginalized citizens. The park where the first victim was found now has a small, quiet memorial, not just for the women who lost their lives, but as a silent acknowledgement of the man who was buried alive by a system that refused to listen to him for nearly 30 years. A career criminal used a deathbed confession to finally pull an innocent man out of the shadows, providing a rare moment of absolute vindication after decades of systemic failure. But in some places, there are no confessions to provide closure, only vast empty landscapes that keep their secrets forever. On the rugged coast of Ireland, a different kind of silence settled over a peat bog where a young girl vanished and the truth was allegedly buried by people in power. On a damp, overcast afternoon in late March of 1977, a 6-year-old girl named Molly was playing quietly in the gravel driveway of her grandparents' remote farmhouse in Cashelard County, Donegal. The farmhouse was an old, sturdy stone building that sat on the edge of the rugged Irish boglands miles away from the nearest town. The sky was a heavy, flat gray, and a thin, cold mist was clinging to the hills that stretched out in every direction. Molly was wearing a bright blue coat and matching Wellington boots, making her a small, vivid splash of color against the dull, mossy green and brown of the countryside. She was a cheerful child who loved visiting the farm, and she spent most of her time following her relatives around as they did their daily chores. On this particular day, the farm was quiet, with only her grandparents and her young Uncle Patrick working around the property while her mother was inside. Her Uncle Patrick, a man in his late 20s, walked out of the barn carrying a heavy wooden ladder on his shoulder. He told Molly he was heading across the fields to return the ladder to a neighbor who lived just over the next hill. It was a routine task, and the neighbor was a close family friend. Molly immediately asked if she could come along, and since the walk was short and the path was familiar, Patrick nodded and told her she could join him if she could keep up. They set off together, walking slowly along a narrow tractor path that wound its way through the peat bogs. The terrain in this part of Donegal was notoriously difficult to navigate even for locals. The ground was made of deep layers of peat that stayed saturated with water throughout the long winter, creating patches of thick black mud that could easily swallow a boot. Patrick had to walk carefully, balancing the heavy ladder while finding the most solid sections of the path. Molly hopped between the clumps of dry grass, trying her best to keep her boots from sinking into the soft earth. She was talking about her school and her friends back home, her voice carrying easily in the still damp air. Patrick looked back every few yards to make sure she was okay, and each time he saw her, smiling and navigating the mud with the ease of a child who had grown up visiting the country. They moved deeper into the bogland, the farmhouse slowly shrinking behind. About 5 minutes into their walk, they reached a low-lying section where the tractor path completely disappeared under a pool of standing water and deep liquid mud. Patrick stopped and looked at the mess, then looked down at his niece's small boots. He realized that she wasn't going to be able to cross this section without getting her coat and her clothes completely soaked. He decided it wasn't worth the trouble, and told Molly it was probably better if she headed back alone. He pointed toward the farmhouse, which was still clearly visible just a few hundred yards behind them. The path was straight, and there were no obstacles between them and the gravel driveway. Patrick told her to go straight into the kitchen and tell her grandmother he would be back in 20 minutes. Molly nodded, turned around, and began walking back the way they had just come. Her small blue coat bobbed up and down as she moved along the higher, drier ground on the tractor path. Patrick stood there for a moment, watching her to make sure she reached the more stable part of the trail. He saw her reach a large, familiar gray rock about halfway to the house, and satisfied that she was perfectly safe, he turned back around and continued his trek over the hill. The landscape was incredibly quiet, with no one else in sight for miles. Aside from the occasional call of a bird, the only sound was the rhythm of Patrick's boots as he carried the heavy wooden ladder. Patrick arrived at the neighbor's house a few minutes later and spent some time chatting while he propped the ladder against their shed. They talked about the weather and the local news standing in the driveway for about 15 minutes before Patrick said his goodbyes. He then turned around and began the walk back to his parents' farm, following the exact same path. He expected to see Molly waiting for him in the yard or playing with her toys on the floor when he arrived. As he crested the final hill and looked down at the farmhouse, the driveway was completely empty. He didn't see a single splash of blue anywhere in the yard. Patrick walked through the front door and into the kitchen, expecting to find her sitting at the wooden table. His mother was standing by the stove, and when Patrick asked if Molly was finished with her walk, his mother looked at him with a confused expression. She told him she had not seen the girl since they left earlier. Patrick felt a slight prickle of unease, but he quickly rationalized the situation. He figured she had probably just wandered into the barn to look for the farm cats, or was playing a game of hide and seek in one of the outbuildings. He walked back outside and began circling the property, calling her name in a loud, steady voice. He checked the tractor, shed the hayloft, and the small garden behind the house, but there was no answer. The wind had picked up, making it harder to hear. He walked back to the edge of the tractor path where he had last seen her, looking for any sign that she had stepped off the trail and into the thick, uneven brush. He walked all the way to the muddy pool where they had parted ways, but the ground was undisturbed. There were no new footprints in the mud and no signs that anyone had fallen or struggled. Patrick ran back to the house, his heart beginning to race, and told the rest of the family that Molly was nowhere to be found. Within an hour, the entire family was outside, fanning out across the immediate fields in a frantic search. They walked in straight lines, their eyes glued to the ground, searching for a dropped ribbon or a small footprint in the moss. The mist was getting much thicker, dropping the visibility and making the vast rolling hills look identical in every direction. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the family realized that their 6-year-old girl had vanished completely. The local police, known as the Garda, arrived just as darkness fell over the bogland. They brought in hundreds of volunteers from the surrounding villages, and soon the hills were filled with the flickering lights of lanterns and flashlights. They dragged the deep black pools of water and used long wooden poles to probe the softest parts of the peat, fearing she had simply stepped into a hidden sinkhole. But as the first night turned into the second day, they found absolutely nothing. The search operation grew into one of the largest and most intensive in the history of the country. Helicopters equipped with thermal cameras flew over the hills, and specialized search teams combed through every abandoned stone cottage, drainage pipe, and well for miles. The investigators were completely baffled because the window of time for an abduction was incredibly small, and the remote nature of the farm meant that any vehicle would have been seen or heard from a great distance. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation hit a massive, immovable wall. The lead detectives began looking into every family member and neighbor, searching for any tiny inconsistency in their stories. They focused heavily on the tractor path, trying to understand how a child could disappear in the few minutes it took her to walk a couple hundred yards toward her own front door. They found no signs of a struggle, no tire tracks on the soft ground, and no physical clues. The local community in Donegal began to whisper about details that were not appearing in the official police reports. People in the nearby villages noted that certain high-ranking officials in the government seemed unusually interested in the case, but not in a way that helped the actual search. Rumors started to circulate that the investigation was being intentionally steered away from a specific individual who had been seen in the immediate area on the day that Molly vanished. These whispers grew into loud and persistent allegations of political interference. Investigative journalists who took an interest in the case suggested that a powerful local figure had intervened to protect a primary suspect from being properly interrogated by the detectives at the time. According to these claims, several officers were ready to make an arrest, but they were supposedly told by their superiors to back off and focus their efforts elsewhere, effectively killing the lead. The suspect in question was someone who lived in the area and was known to the family, which would explain why Molly wouldn't have screamed or run away if they had approached her on the path. According to this theory, the person intercepted her during the few minutes she was alone, took her away in a vehicle that was hidden from Patrick's view by the rolling hills, and then used their political connections to ensure that their property was never thoroughly searched by the police. Decades later, retired officers finally began to speak out about the pressure they felt during the initial weeks of the disappearance. They described a climate of fear and silence where asking the wrong questions about certain powerful families could end a career. They alleged that the most promising leads were ignored and that key witnesses were never officially interviewed on the record. This narrative of a state-sponsored cover-up turned a tragic disappearance into a national scandal. Despite several high-profile cold case reviews and the emergence of new witnesses over the last 40 years, the ground in Cashellard has never given up its secret. Molly remains the longest-running missing child case in Irish history, a permanent and painful empty space for her family and the entire nation. Her relatives continue to hold annual vigils, their hair now white and their voices tired, still asking for someone to come forward with the truth before the final witnesses pass away. The case of the girl who walked back toward her farmhouse and vanished into thin air remains a festering wound. It is a story defined by the silence of the rugged Irish landscape and the alleged secrets kept by those in power. The vast, mist-covered peat bog remains as indifferent as ever, swallowing up all sound and footprints under a gray Irish sky. It is a place where the physical isolation of the rural countryside provided a perfect, natural cover for a crime that left no trace. But sometimes the most dangerous places on Earth are not the lonely, mist-covered hills where a child can walk for miles without seeing a single soul. Sometimes the most hidden threats are found in the most densely populated urban environments where people live on top of one another in crowded high-rise buildings. You would think that having hundreds of neighbors just a few feet away would offer some form of protection, and that it would be impossible for a crime to happen in silence. As we travel thousands of miles away from the quiet bogs of Ireland to the busy vertical landscape of Singapore, we find a family who believed they were safe inside their modern public housing flat. They lived in one of the most secure and heavily monitored cities in the world, surrounded by neighbors on every side. But they were about to discover that a locked door and a crowded hallway offer no defense against a killer who knows exactly when to strike and how to disappear. In the early morning hours of a Tuesday in January 1979, a 31-year-old mother named May moved quietly through her small kitchen in a high-rise apartment complex in Singapore. The building was part of a massive housing estate where thousands of families lived in close proximity, and the sound of distant traffic was already beginning to hum through the open windows of the unit, signaling the start of another busy day in the city. Her husband, Tan, was already dressed for his early shift at a local electronics factory. They worked hard to provide for their 4 children, who were all still sound asleep in the adjacent bedroom. The kids were aged 7, 8, 9, and 10. Before leaving, May walked to the bedroom door and looked inside, seeing the blankets rising and falling in a rhythmic, peaceful cadence that suggested everything in their world was exactly as it should be. The apartment was kept in immaculate condition, a source of pride for the young couple. Laundry poles hung heavy with damp clothes out on the small balcony, swaying slightly in the humid morning air. May and Tan stepped out of the flat at 6:30, double-locking the heavy wooden front door behind them. They felt a deep sense of security, knowing that their neighbors were just a few feet away on either side of the thin concrete walls. The children were old enough to get themselves ready for school later in the morning, and the neighborhood was considered one of the safest in the world. This was a place where people often left their doors unlocked during the day, and children played freely in the common corridors. May planned to return around 10 o'clock during her work break to check in on them, make sure they had eaten their breakfast, and help the youngest children get ready. May spent her morning working at a nearby market focused on her tasks, but occasionally glancing at the clock. When 10 o'clock finally arrived, she set down her tools and walked back toward the housing complex. As she climbed the stairs to the 5th floor, she noticed the hallway was unusually quiet. Normally, you could hear the muffled sounds of televisions or the rhythmic clattering of dishes from the neighbors, but today, the corridor felt still. She reached her front door and inserted her key. It turned smoothly, indicating it was still locked exactly as she had left it. She stepped into the narrow entryway and called out for the children, expecting to hear them laughing or running toward her. Instead, there was an absolute heavy silence that seemed to fill every corner of the flat. She walked further inside, noticing that the kitchen table was clean and the bedroom was entirely empty. She then noticed a thin, steady stream of water trickling out from under the bathroom door, creating a small puddle on the linoleum. May knocked on the wooden door and asked if they were almost finished, but there was no response. She rationalized that they were probably just playing with the water or had forgotten to turn the tap off after washing their faces. The sound of the running water was the only thing filling the silence of the apartment. She reached for the handle and pushed the door open, but as the door swung back, the steam from the hot water cleared, and she saw a scene of total devastation. The 4 children were all inside the small bathroom, but none of them were moving. They had been placed together in a way that defied any logical explanation. May didn't scream at first. Her brain simply refused to process the visual information. She stood in the doorway for several seconds. She watched the water from the sink continue to overflow and splash onto the floor, mixing with the dark liquid pooling around her own feet. When the reality finally set in, she stumbled back into the hallway and let out a sound that alerted the entire floor. Neighbors came running out of their units, and within minutes, the narrow corridor was crowded with panicked residents. The local police arrived shortly after and cordoned off the entire wing. The investigators who walked into that bathroom were hardened veterans, but even they were visibly shaken by the scene. As the forensic team began their work, they noticed a detail that made the crime even more disturbing. The killer had stayed in the apartment for an extended period after the attack. There were clear signs that the bodies had been carefully washed after the fact. Even more unsettling, the killer had used the sink to thoroughly clean themselves. The lead detective examined the front door and the windows, looking for any sign of a break-in. There were no scratches on the locks, no signs of prying, and no broken glass. This meant the children had either recognized the person at the door and let them in willingly, or the killer possessed a key. Given how cautious the parents were with their security, the idea of a stranger just walking into the flat seemed entirely impossible to the police. Police spent the next several days interviewing over 100 people living in the high-rise complex. In a building with such thin walls and constant foot traffic, it was nearly impossible for anyone to move unnoticed. Yet not a single neighbor reported hearing a struggle, a cry for help, or seeing a suspicious person in the hallway that morning. The killer had operated with a level of silence that suggested they knew the family's exact schedule. 2 weeks passed, and the apartment remained a hollow shell of what it once was. May and Tan were staying with relatives, unable to return to the site of the tragedy. One afternoon, they received a small stack of mail that had been forwarded to their temporary address. Among the bills and letters was a bright, festive envelope. It was a Chinese New Year card. When Tan opened it, he saw a picture of happy children playing together in a sun-drenched park. But when he looked at the handwritten message inside, his hands began to shake violently. The text was written in Mandarin, and it addressed May and Tan by the intimate private nicknames that only their closest family members and oldest friends knew. The message was a direct and cruel taunt. It mocked the couple for their loss and specifically referenced the medical fact that they would never be able to have any more children in the future. Police immediately traced the origin of the card and found it had been mailed from a local post office just a few days after the funeral. However, the forensic analysis on the paper turned up no useful fingerprints. The handwriting was deliberate and slanted, likely intended to hide the sender's true identity. The investigation shifted focus to the inner circle of the family, looking for anyone who might have harbored a deep hidden resentment. Despite years of searching and thousands of hours of intense interrogations, the Singaporean authorities could never gather enough physical evidence to make a definitive arrest. The case eventually went cold, leaving a permanent shadow over the city's reputation for absolute safety. May and Tan eventually left the country, hoping to find a place where they weren't surrounded by the memories of the silence that filled their fifth-floor flat. They lived the rest of their lives in a state of quiet mourning, never receiving the answers they so desperately sought. The high-rise apartment was eventually renovated and occupied by a new family, and the common corridors returned to their usual sounds of life and laughter. But for those who remember the winter of 1979, the building remains a monument to a mystery that proved even the most secure environments can be breached. On the day of the funeral, the streets surrounding the housing estate were lined with thousands of people who had come to pay their respects. The atmosphere was heavy with a collective sense of shock as the city struggled to reconcile its identity as a safe haven with the reality of what had occurred inside that flat. Tan stood by the small coffins, his face a mask of exhaustion, while May was supported by her sisters as she struggled to stand. Neighbors who lived directly next door were haunted by the silence of that morning. They recalled hearing the distant sound of an elevator and the faint clicking of doors, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. One woman remembered seeing the children playing in the hallway just the day before, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls. Now she kept her own children inside and bolted her door even during the brightest hours of the day. The investigation eventually focused on a local man who had been a frequent visitor to the apartment, someone the children had reportedly called an uncle. He was brought in for questioning several times, and his alibi was scrutinized by the lead detectives. While he displayed an unusual level of knowledge about the family's internal affairs, the physical evidence was simply not there to link him to the scene in the bathroom. He was eventually released, but the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted from his reputation. The police continued to follow up on anonymous tips for years, but each lead proved to be a dead end. The weapon used in the attack was never recovered, and the kitchen towels that had been used to clean the scene provided no DNA evidence in an era before such technology was widely available. The killer had successfully erased their tracks. The Geylang Bahru flat became a symbol of a city's lost innocence. Even today, older residents of the complex speak in hushed tones about the morning the water began to leak into the hallway. They look at the festive cards they received during the holidays with a slight sense of hesitation, remembering the one that was delivered to May and Tan. It is a story that remains frozen in time, waiting for a confession that will likely never come. The story of the Geylang Bahru family serves as a reminder that the most dangerous threats are often the ones that walk right through the front door with a smile and a key. It is a mystery defined by a clean bathroom, a running tap, and a festive card that carried a message of absolute malice. The killer moved like a shadow through a crowded city, leaving behind a family destroyed by someone who knew their deepest secrets and their private names. As the city of Singapore continued to grow and modernize, the memories of 1979 were slowly buried under layers of progress. It remains a case that challenges the logic of security and the trust we place in those we call our friends. But as the winter of that year faded into a warm summer across the ocean, a different kind of crowded environment was preparing to host a tragedy that was far more public and far more loud. On a freezing Saturday night in early June of 1979, a 34-year-old father named James walked through the main gates of Luna Park in Sydney, Australia. He was holding the hands of his two young sons, 5-year-old David and 4-year-old Chris. The air was sharp and cold, but the park was packed with families enjoying the winter carnival. They walked past the massive grinning face that marked the entrance to the park. The boys were vibrating with excitement, pointing at the flashing neon lights and the giant Ferris wheel spinning against the black harbor sky. James checked his watch and saw it was just after 9 at night. He had promised them one last ride before they headed home. They joined a long, shivering line of people waiting to board the ghost train, which was a dark, winding indoor ride filled with mechanical ghosts and loud, sudden noises. As they shuffled closer to the front of the line, the boys laughed at the painted skeletons on the walls. The ride operator, a young man in a heavy coat, was ushering people into small wooden cars that ran on a single metal track. James helped his sons into a car and then climbed in behind them, pulling the safety bar down across their laps. The car lurched forward, disappearing through a set of heavy black curtains and into the darkness. Inside the ride, the atmosphere was pitch black. Every few seconds, a plastic skeleton would pop out of a hidden door or a recorded scream would echo through the narrow corridors. The boys gripped their father's arms, thrilled by the manufactured fear. But about halfway through the tunnel, James noticed something that wasn't part of the show. A faint, bitter smell began to fill the car, and it didn't smell like the usual dust and old grease. It smelled like something organic was burning. James leaned forward, squinting through the dark, trying to see if there was a technical problem with the track. As the car rounded a sharp corner, he saw a thick gray cloud of smoke swirling under the ceiling. He assumed it was a new fog machine effect designed to make the ride more atmospheric, but as they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the air became noticeably hotter and the smoke grew thicker. Suddenly, the wooden car ground to a halt. The electric motor hummed for a second and then went completely silent. The recorded music and the screams cut off, leaving the three of them sitting in total darkness. James felt a wave of heat wash over his face. He told the boys to stay calm and stay in the car, thinking the operator would simply reset the power and bring them back out to the loading platform in just a few moments. But the power never came back on. Instead, James heard a crackling sound coming from the walls behind them. A soft orange glow began to flicker deep in the tunnel, reflecting off the metal tracks. He realized with a jolt of panic that the structure was actually on fire. He shoved the safety bar up, grabbed both of his sons, and stepped out of the car. He began feeling his way along the walls, desperately searching for an emergency exit. Outside on the boardwalk, the ride operator noticed thick black smoke pouring out of the exit tunnel. He tried to hit the emergency stop, but the control panel was already dead. Within seconds, the entire ghost train building erupted into a massive ball of fire. Because the ride was built like a long, narrow chimney, the flames moved with incredible speed, feeding on the dry timber and the grease-covered tracks. People began screaming and running away. Fire crews arrived within minutes, but the heat was so intense they couldn't get within 50 feet of the entrance. They watched helplessly as the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. By the time the flames were finally extinguished 2 hours later, the iconic ride was nothing but a pile of smoldering ash and twisted metal. Investigators moved into the ruins the next morning, but they weren't looking for a cause yet. They were looking for the victims. They eventually found 7 people inside. James and his 2 sons were found huddled together near a section of the track that led to a dead end. 4 other students who had been on a separate car were also found nearby. The local police conducted a very brief investigation lasting only a few days before officially declaring the fire an accident. They told the public that an electrical fault in the old wiring had sparked the blaze and closed the case. For decades, the families of the victims refused to accept that explanation. They pointed out that the ride had been inspected just weeks earlier and the wiring was in perfect condition. Journalists began digging into the background of the park and discovered that a notorious crime boss had been trying to buy the waterfront land for years. He wanted to clear the park to build luxury apartments, but the management had repeatedly refused to sell their lease. Years later, a new witness came forward who had worked as a security guard at the park on the night of the fire. He claimed that he had seen 3 men running away from the back of the ghost train building just minutes before the first flames appeared. When he tried to report this to the detectives at the time, he was told to keep his mouth shut if he wanted to keep his job. He had lived in fear of the crime boss's associates for over 30 years. Further investigations revealed that several key pieces of evidence, including the remains of the electrical box, had been mysteriously destroyed by the police shortly after the initial inquiry. In 2021, a massive government inquest was finally opened to re-examine the tragedy. They uncovered evidence that the fire had been deliberately set using an accelerant, confirming that the electrical fault theory was a lie designed to protect the arsonists. It is now widely believed that the fire was a professional hit ordered by the crime boss to bankrupt the park and force the sale of the land. Because of the corruption within the local police department at the time, the people who set the fire were never caught or charged. James and his sons died because of a land dispute they knew nothing about. The grinning face at the park entrance still stands today, a silent witness to a crime that took 40 years to admit